Hello and welcome to Global News Today. I'm Micheal Prendergast, and coming up in the show, I'm joined by Mike Baker, the former CIA officer and host of the President's Daily Brief podcast. He joins us to break down Trump's push to release the Epstein files, the Gaza Plan vote, escalating tensions with Maduro, Iran's latest Gulf moves, the China-Taiwan security row, and Ukraine's energy sector scandal. Mike Baker, thanks so much for your time. It's a pleasure to have you back here at Arabiya English. I'd like to start off with Epstein. President Trump is pushing House Republicans to release the Epstein files. Trump himself, he has said he has nothing to hide. Is this a strategy to control the narrative?
Most definitely. And it's a strategy that they should have stuck with at the very beginning. Right? This is a bit of a self-inflicted wound here. It's not hard to understand that with all the chatter and all the talk, all the social media around the Epstein files in the relatively recent past, their first go-to should have been release it all, right? That's what the White House should have done from the very beginning. And look, Epstein was in that, it appears Epstein was in the business of trying to collect high-profile, influential contacts, right? And it doesn't appear as if he cared whether they were Democrats or Republicans, and he was equal opportunity. So, yeah, if the Democrats imagine somehow that this is all going to fall on the Republican side, I think they're seriously mistaken. But there's been so much made about this that I really don't understand why the White House from the very beginning wouldn't have said, release it all, let's get it out there.
With references to Trump in some of the emails, how risky is this politically for him?
Well, I think that they're not stupid, right? They can sometimes seem a bit chaotic there at the Trump White House and in the Trump administration. But I suspect that these files have already been looked at. And so I don't think there's going to be any bombshell surprises when it comes to Trump. I don't know about any other contacts of Epstein's, but I would be surprised if after this period of time that they haven't pretty much become aware of what's in there and what's not. So I don't think there's going to be a lot here. And this is much like a lot of things that happened in Washington, D.C. So a lot of noise, a lot of talk, a lot of social media. Oh my God, this is going to ruin somebody on one side of the aisle or the other. And usually that's not the case. Usually it all fizzles out. So I'm not one of those people that thinks, this is going to have some massive explosive impact on anybody, frankly.
That brings me on to my next question. Do you think the releasing of the full tranche of documents could uncover anything new, or is it mostly public already?
Yeah, I think that, look, it's not mostly public. I think there'll be a lot here that people will want to, scrub and go through. Maybe it's just because I've spent a long time, watching what happens in Washington, D.C., and I'm fairly cynical. Investigations, that's where, investigations go to die, is Washington, D.C. And so I don't know that there's going to be anything. Never say never. Maybe there's something in there that's going to, really upend things in Washington or somewhere else, wherever. Again, he was making contacts throughout the business and political world, right, as we saw from Prince Andrew's situation. So whether there's another Prince Andrew-like scandal in those files that are, probably going to be released, I have no idea. That would be speculation. But I'd go back to what I had said earlier, which is that the best thing you can do from a strategic communications perspective in a situation like this is to get full transparency, or as close to full transparency as you can.
How unusual is it for a president to publicly pressure his own party on a sensitive DOJ investigation?
Well, that's a really good question. It's an important question, too, because there's a lot of concern right now regarding the White House's influence or attempts to influence the Department of Justice. Now, the DOJ has a reputation, an image. Whether it was always meeting that image or not, of being nonpartisan, of being outside of politics. Again, I'm not saying that they always have been, because clearly there have been cases where the DOJ was influenced by politics, but that was their go-to image. And the Trump administration has reportedly been pushing on that. There have been a lot of attorneys fired. There have been requests from the White House to pursue particular investigations or to drop others. So I think this is, we're in a very interesting times here in terms of the separation and the independence of the Department of Justice. In an ideal world, the DOJ is not influenced by any outside parties, by any political party, or by any other influence. It's a completely independent organization. That's how it's supposed to be. But that's in the, that's in a hoped for world, and that doesn't often match up with reality.
And one question in my mind is, the Democrats were in power for 4 years. They were mostly silent on this issue, and now it's very much at the top of their agenda. Is that a coincidence?
No, and you're right to point that out. That, look, nothing happens by coincidence in Washington. It's all driven by self-interest in politics. That makes me sound very cynical, but I think I'm on the right track here. So anything that they can use to try to beat Trump and the Trump administration, they'll go to, right? Sometimes without really giving it a lot of thought. And by that, I mean, there'll probably be just as many Democrat names and high-profile Democrats who Epstein was associating with as any references to Trump, right? But they're hoping for anything. And the Democrat Party right now in the U.S. is struggling. They're trying to find their footing, right? And they're trying to figure out how do they regain power. That's all that's all any political party, frankly, is interested in for the most part. So they're struggling with an identity, but their only identity recently seems to be not Trump. Go after Trump. Anything that is against the Trump administration, that seems to be their position right now and their identity. But they've got to get out of that, and they've got to figure out what they stand for, or what the bulk of their base stands for, if they're going to have any hope of regaining power, either in the midterm elections or in the next presidential election.
And in terms of the mind of a former CIA agent, as you said, the focus on Trump, is this a case of Trump derangement syndrome within the Democratic Party?
Yeah, I think it is. Look, I think that the Democrats and the Republicans, anybody who's calling for transparency, I'm all for. That's a good thing. But there are a lot of Democrats who are doing this simply because they think it's an opportunity to push back on Trump or to score some points. Is Trump derangement syndrome real? Well, yeah, I think it is. He occupies a lot of space in the Democrats' heads, and they can't seem to get out of that. They're going to need to, though, right? I don't think that their answer, I don't think their solution for regaining power is to veer harder left, right? And it's that hard left edge of the Democrat Party that is mostly contaminated with this, if you want to call it, Trump derangement syndrome, right? And it's the hard progressive left side. Now, those folks are enamored of people like Mamdani, or the new mayor-elect in Seattle, who's a socialist as well. And they imagine they can, come up with a form of socialism that for once in modern history is going to work. Good luck to them if they think they can, create a socialist environment that actually succeeds, because it hasn't so far.
I'd like to move on to the next section, Gaza. The UN is set to vote on Trump's Gaza plan, including an international force and a transitional governance. What's your take on the plan?
Yeah, this is really important, and this is a very interesting development that's happening fairly quietly. But it looks like the U.S., the White House is veering towards saying, look, we can start the reconstruction without disarming or going through that disarmament process with Hamas, right? Because that was part of the 20-point peace plan. Disarm, step aside, you have no role in governance. Well, Hamas has refused to do either of those things. And in fact, evidence indicates that they have been, trying to rearm They never actually disarmed, so they're actually just building up their abilities again. They've been asserting themselves and retaking areas that the Israelis have withdrawn from. So if the U.S. administration imagines that they can go into Gaza with a reconstruction plan while Hamas is essentially still in control of significant portions of the enclave, I'm not quite sure what they're thinking. It's a strange change to the plan.
The plan hints at a future Palestinian state, which Israel strongly opposes. How could that tension affect its success?
Well, everything's affecting the potential success. This is a very fragile environment, right? You've got Hamas unwilling to disarm or to step aside in terms of governance. You've got the Israelis saying, look, the Palestinian Authority cannot and Fatah cannot play a role in governance. You've got an international concept of a stabilization force. But, again, does anyone imagine that Egypt and Qatar and UAE and others are going to send personnel into Gaza to disarm Hamas? And that's essentially what Israel's been calling for. And that was part of the plan. Was one of the jobs of the International Stabilization Force was to ensure that, not just stand there and look for peace, but to actually work to disarm terrorist elements in Gaza. There are a myriad of ways that this thing falls apart. And again, I know that makes me sound very cynical, but I tend to be a fairly pragmatic, realistic individual. Hope is a good thing. We should all, be hopeful and want the best, right? The people of Gaza deserve a much better future. But I'm also very realistic in saying that hope isn't necessarily what should drive your policies.
The draft includes creating a new Palestinian police force. How effective could that be in a territory long controlled by Hamas?
Well, that is you pointed to, again, this conflict that exists, that it seems like people talking about the peace plan are willing to just say, well, okay, well, that might be complicated, but let's just move forward, right? We're just going to do this. And they've talked about, ever since they started this, they've acted as if somehow Hamas, which hasn't changed its objectives and is still in lockstep with the Iranian regime, they've acted as if, yes, they're just going to comply. They're going to lay down their weapons. They're going to, agree to leave, to go to some third country. There's this concept that's been part of this peace plan that I've struggled to understand because it flies in the face of everything we've seen up till now. So the police force, look, the training of the police force, sure, you can do that. You can vet the new recruits. You can have Egypt and Jordan. Jordan is extremely good at, putting together something like this. And you can try, but as long as Hamas is in there and they don't want to give up control, and the citizens of Gaza probably aren't particularly interested in seeing Fatah or the Palestinian Authority come in, they're not particularly well liked. So I'm struggling to understand how this comes together, right? I understand that we're all hoping that it does, but again, I don't know that matches up with reality.
And how about American or allied boots on the ground? I know there's been a lot of talk about this in a camp in Gaza, but on the Israeli border. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, look, there's already sort of a U.S.-led military command structure, right, that's been set up in Israel that essentially is there to oversee or to monitor and assist with the logistics of humanitarian relief and aid supplies. But there is no chance that there would be U.S. boots on the ground inside Gaza. Right? That's just, you can never make a sure bet when it comes to, the strategy in Washington, but I think that's as close as you get to a sure bet.
Moving on to Venezuela now. Trump has ordered another strike on a narco-terrorist boat, and it's starting to look like a Cold War with Maduro is turning hot. What does this escalation signal about U.S. strategy? Yeah,
this is a massive question that exists in Washington, and people all over the world trying to figure this out. What is the U.S. strategy for Venezuela? Is it regime change? Is it to put sufficient pressure on the regime so that Maduro steps aside? That would be ideal, right? That's what you want. Again, I don't think anybody is particularly keen on, actually moving into Venezuela in a kinetic mode with troops and, and a conflict, right? I would be surprised if that's the end result. That's not the same as saying they've identified cartel or narco trafficking facilities or structures inside Venezuela, and maybe they become a target, right? But as far as the buildup of military assets in the Caribbean and around Venezuela, I think that is definitely designed to send a message and try to influence those around Maduro to either get him to step aside or to essentially hand him over. And then the ideal, again, whether the ideal ends up matching reality, that's always the question. But the ideal would be then the opposition government, which, legitimately won the last election and Maduro stole it from them. It would be ideal to have that government come in, because the people of Venezuela, Venezuela used to be one of the wealthiest countries in the region. Now it's a basket case, thanks to Hugo Chavez and Maduro and this desire to create a socialist nirvana. So, congratulations. They've driven the country into the ground. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country. They deserve much, much better, right? But I don't think that, going in there with boots on the ground, to take on Maduro and the Venezuelan military, I don't think that's the design here.
The U.S. is returning to jungle training in Panama for the first time in decades. Is this a coincidence?
Well, I think you can read a lot into it, and you can read into it all. There's a direct line here to the idea that they're going to move into Venezuela and conflict and remove Maduro physically through military action. Or you can look at it and say, well, yeah, if we're stepping up our counter narcotics operations in the region, which clearly we are, then that's a good move. And you want your military training in all environments. Panama used to be a prime training ground for U.S. military. So I think I'm not reading too much into that in terms of, is that connected to the next move, which could be, military maneuvers inside Venezuela to remove Maduro? I'm not really reading into that. I think the goal here is to get Maduro to the point where he says, I can't, obviously I can't stay in power, or his close advisors, to make that decision for him.
Moving on to the Strait of Hormuz now. Iran has seized a petrochemical tanker in the Gulf amid rising tensions. What message are they trying to send?
Yeah, that's a really interesting development. They've been relatively quiet over the past year and a half, 2 years in terms of seizing ships. It used to be a little bit more common for the Iranians to do this. But I think what they're probably doing is messaging and saying, look, we're still out here. We still control this incredibly important strategic waterway where, a 20% more of the world's oil transits on a daily basis. So I think the Iranian regime and the IRGC are probably trying to remind the world that they can do this. And anytime they do seize a ship in this area, it has immediate impact on global markets.
And Iran is facing a generational drought. Can you give some context of the importance of this drought domestically in Iran?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. This is a really important story. This is impacting in particular the citizens of Tehran. Millions and millions of people facing a catastrophic, really, water shortage. And the Iranian regime has been trying to handle this right? Because this is a basic need, obviously, of people. And the thing that the mullahs and the IRGC fear the most, obviously, is an uprising from inside. And there's no easier way to lose control of the population than to run out of water and food. So this is a result of decades of mismanagement on the Iranian government's side. Obviously, a drought plays into it, but they have mismanaged this so badly over the years, and part of that is a corruption problem that now the citizens of Tehran and Mashhad, they're facing this catastrophic problem. They're rationing water even as we speak. They're talking about this could they could run out in the next week or week and a half. Masoud Pezeshkian, the president, has talked about, well, maybe we need to relocate the capital. So I'm glad you brought this up because this has flown under the radar.
One has to question the timing as well. The Strait of Hormuz handles a fifth of global oil transport. Is this Iran's show of strength amid a domestic crisis or a distraction?
I think it's a distraction. I think they're looking for anything to deflect from what they're facing internally. Right? Again, look, they all, whether you're talking about the mullahs of Iran, whether you're talking about Putin, whether you're talking about Xi Jinping, the thing that or Maduro, what do they fear? Well, they fear losing power by losing control of the population. And so typically people, despots or people running countries like that are authoritarian or autocratic, they always go to an outside boogeyman, right? When things get tough internally. So I think this is part of that messaging, is to try to distract from what's happening inside Iran.
Moving on to China now. What was the row over the Prime Minister of Japan, Takayashi's comments about a Chinese attack on Taiwan could trigger a Japanese response? How has China reacted?
Well, Beijing took real exception to the Japanese Prime Minister's comments recently when she, basically said that a Chinese move on Taiwan would be seen by Japan as a survival issue, right? And would prompt potentially a military response. So China did what they always do when they feel as if somebody's, in their words, meddling in their internal affairs. They have a show of force, and in this case, they sailed part of their Coast Guard past what the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, which are disputed islands that the Chinese also claim. The Chinese call them something different, the Diaoyu Islands. So basically, the Chinese are rattling their saber in response to those comments. They actually, protested to the Japanese ambassador. They called the ambassador in, and it's not uncommon. This is kind of their pattern of behavior, but it's another indication of just how tense things are in that region. And in particular between China and Japan.
And Taiwan is so crucially important for the West's access to chips for data centers, for AI, for electronics. The US is surely monitoring the situation closely.
Absolutely, yeah. The U.S. pays a great deal of attention to anything related to Taiwan. Look, the Chinese regime, Xi Jinping is basically saying the Japanese comments from Sanae Takaichi, the Japanese prime minister, that just shows that Japan is towing the U.S. line, and they're trying to contain China's rise. Xi Jinping is convinced that China should be at the top of the food chain. That's basically where he's going with this. And he also believes that there's no reason why Taiwan should not be back in the fold, right, of the mainland. And that's his goal. Now, whether that's accomplished through kinetic action against Taiwan, whether it's economic pressure and action against Taiwan, that's something that is being gamed out everywhere right now. Everybody's interested in what's going to happen here. The timeline, nobody knows. I've talked to people who are extremely well briefed on all of this, and they believe we could be looking at 2028 in terms of a move of some sort, and however that would look. Part of this is how long does Xi Jinping have in power, right? And is he willing to walk off into the sunset without moving on Taiwan? So there's a lot of elements here that people are trying to figure out. But every time there's an incident like this, whether it's between Japan and China, or whether the Chinese military flies more aircraft into Taiwanese airspace to test their defenses or just to send a message, it's just another reminder that we've got this flashpoint that exists, that the policy of strategic ambiguity over the years isn't going to work. At some point, we've got to figure out what is our response if China moves on Taiwan.
Just lastly, Mike, we're going to move on to Ukraine. $100 million embezzled in Ukraine's energy sector, with several implicated close to Zelenskyy. How much does this hurt his credibility and complicate anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine?
This corruption issue in Kyiv right now, related to their energy sector, a $100 million reportedly kickback scheme, is a real problem for Zelenskyy, and he's acting like it. Right? He's moving on this very quickly because he understands how damaging this could be. Right? He's out there asking constantly for foreign aid, billions of dollars in aid and resources. He cannot afford to be tied closely to a scandal like this. And the problem is that one of his ex-business associates and business partners, a guy named Timur Mindich, who's now fled Ukraine, is supposedly, reportedly anyway, according to the Anti-Corruption Bureau there in Kyiv, kind of at the heart of this scandal. So this is a real problem that people should be watching and paying attention to, because it will impact undoubtedly how the EU and how the US view their assistance to Ukraine.
And just about Mindich, he fled hours before he was meant to be arrested. He was surely tipped off.
Yeah, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, yeah, I think if he took off, in fact, if the reporting is accurate, and he took off hours before the anti-corruption authorities showed up at his residence, yeah, that's a clue, right? You don't have to be, Poirot to see that. So somehow he got wind of this, and I'm sure they're, digging into that as well as all the other elements of this. But again, this is in a very sensitive time. And Zelenskyy, it does appear like Zelenskyy understands it this time. He kind of blundered into a self-inflicted wound recently when he tried to take more government control of these anti-corruption elements within the government. That was an incredibly stupid move, and he walked that back. But this time around, it appears as if he understands how aggressive he has to be in trying to show that he's cleaning house.
And just briefly, Mike, the war is grinding on to another winter. Are we any closer to a peace agreement?
No, is the short answer. Are we any closer to a peace agreement? Not that anyone can see. Putin doesn't appear to be interested at this stage in an off-ramp. Don't think he sees an upside to it.
Is it because he's winning? Is it because he's winning?
I do believe that Putin thinks that he is, in a way, winning. And part of it may be that he doesn't see a way to get out of it, right? And that's different than saying he thinks he's losing. He may well want to wrap this up, right? It is costing his economy enormously, right? His energy infrastructure is taking a beating just from the homegrown Ukrainian ability to strike deeper inside Russia with their drone efforts and their homegrown missile systems. So, it may be that Putin wants to get out of it. He just doesn't see how that works without losing an enormous amount of face here and potential support from the Russian population.
We're just out of time. Mike Baker, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, man. Take care.
That's all we have time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join us tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.